realised a lot of the 7 inches weren't actually coming in from Jamaica. They were getting pressed here. So what they was doing was they were actually taking curry powder and rubbing them on the outside of the box. First time SoundSystem had ever went into the West End. And then what he then proceeded was incredible, because he then got a venue on Carnaby Street. And Carnaby Street back then was literally factories. Black and mixed race kids were coming out of the thing. And of course, they weren't going to necessarily be punk rock lovers, but they was going to have it with the skinheads. So you'd have all these guys with flying elbows and flying kicks, and it was a full-on, it was out of a film, it was a kung fu film, literally. Mattress beating. So they used to the blue mattress, they used to throw that on you, and they'd all have like 3 or 4 of them come in the cell with truncheons, and literally, you know, it smashed the living shit out. I remember that when it went off in 81, and it was absolutely mad, because it was building up. It went off in Brixton, and then it was coming down. You could see it, because the tension was just building. I remember the street, everyone was out on the street, black and white, you know. People don't realise some of this stuff with Britain, because people have got this modern thing in their head that, you know, it's always been fabulous, great. I remember in the 70s, they used to turn electricity off, right? They had power cuts, yeah. They used to turn electricity.
I remember that. And you sit there with
candles, yeah.
Remember that.
Candles, right? There were bodies that couldn't be buried, right? You had bodies stacking up, do you know what I mean? At fucking morgues. It was a state of a third world country. A lot of credit isn't given or identified to, you know, scenes that have emerged, like Acid House and, you know, like the whole Warehouse Party scenes, to its real origins, which are blues parties, which people don't even understand. But we're going to make that connection today and, you know, authorise to let you know this is real.
Right, lights, camera, action. On this week's show, I have someone in the cab who grew up in London and was heavily involved with the early Acid House, Warehouse raves in the late 80s. And was one of the organisers of Genesis. He also grew up around SoundSystem culture, and in the late 90s he helped revive the iconic Reggae Sunsplash festival. He was featured on Donald McIntyre's TV programme Coconut and Coconuts, and was acquitted of a £100 million drug seizure. Later on, he was given a 15-year prison sentence, and whilst in prison, he turned his life around and committed himself to supporting the younger prisoners who got caught up in all the madness. He set up the AP Foundation, which is now a leading rehabilitation charity for helping the young. His conscience become his guide. He's now an author of a brand new book about his incredible journey called Empire of Dirt. We have the Diamond Geezer in the back of the world-class London Black Cab. We got Andrew Pritchard in the back. Yes, Andy.
How are you, Steve?
This, mate. I'll tell you what, it's a real honour to have you in the back, and I'm really sort of blown away that, you know, you've stepped forward to do this, this interview with me. It really means a lot, because my channel isn't huge, but, you know, it's really important, because I know the stuff we're going to be covering as well. We're going to go deep on the SoundSystem culture as well, isn't it?
You see, the thing as well, Steve, what you're doing, I think, is a great podcast. It's the integrity of what it does, you know. I've seen a few of the, you know, your shows. And as I said, there's something that appealed to me, you know. All right, it's not probably the biggest channel out there, but hopefully it will grow into that if you so want it. But as I said, it does serve a fabulous purpose, especially for people wanting to understand the roots of a lot of these, you know, origins of a lot of these things like music and social history. So, yeah,
100%.
Well done.
And as you know, I do it for a hobby and I do it for the love. So that's what it's all about to me. You know, but it's going to be a fascinating listen this, and I can't wait to talk at the end about the, your new book, Empire of Dirt, which looks, you know, absolutely incredible. And also, we're going to go, at the end of this interview, we're going to go on a little all-city walkabout around, like, the Hackney area, and go back to some of the old, you know, the old haunts of where these places, like the Four Aces.
Absolutely, yeah. Definitely.
You know, maybe the Pepper Pot.
Yeah, we could travel past all those places, because these kind of places should actually have blue plaques outside them, because these 100%. Are parts of history that, you know, we don't want to forget them, you know, because they played a very integral part of making these areas what they are actually today. Even though people now look at them as incredibly gentrified, they were a place where people came first to settle.
There was a real hub,
and
wasn't they? There was a hub of the community.
It really was, and its stamps left deeply embedded on these areas, so you mustn't forget that.
But yeah, it's going to be incredible to go back to a few of them old places and spots, and go and check them out.
To them because they're part of history now.
It's proper London historical history, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, this is, as I said, it's going to be a special interview, because we're going to go very in depth in terms of the reggae sound system culture. But what I'm going to do is take it back to the 8th of May 1945. Like, the Second World War has ended. London had been heavily bombed during the Blitz. Over 1 million buildings turned into rubble. Over 30,000 deaths. And 1.5 million people displaced and made homeless. And that's just in London. So, there was rationing right up until 1954. Andy, it must have been like a living hell just after, World War II. London was completely bombed out.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people forget is, thank God we've never experienced war, but for a generation like my parents to have experienced it, and, grandparents who were actually on the, front line of it, it was a terrible experience, more than any of us could possibly even, in our wildest dreams imagine. And as you're right, and particularly East End of London was particularly hit, and the reason being because this was a time of the Blitz, because the idea was to break the working class people who were the backbone, because you understand a lot of these men, they went out, and they were on the front line, and they were drawn from these kind of areas, as I said, and they felt if they could basically break the spirit of their families and break the spirit of the community, that way they would actually have a great position and feel that they had the upper ground. But they got that wrong, because in the East End, particularly in North West London, people fight very, very, very hard. It's resilience, and that was the spirit around these areas of Hackney and Bethnal Green. It dug in deep. So, we couldn't even start to imagine. So, if I go back there a little bit, my dad was obviously very young at the time. My grandfather, two of his brothers, they fought in the war. They fought on the front line. My grandfather wasn't allowed to fight in the war because he was what's described as a master builder. So they wanted him to basically be here to build bomb shelters and repair buildings that had been, bombed. So for St Paul's Cathedral, places like that, they kept behind the what they call the high-end tradesmen, because again, when people saw historic buildings, being bombed and damaged, it will break the morale of the people. So the government, Winston Churchill, didn't want it to happen, so it was important that those were the buildings had to be, maintained a certain presence to let people know London was London back then, So he was held back. The work he'd done, they used to use Italian prisoners of war as the labourers back then. That's what they used to do. So my dad was sent off to Cornwall, him and his sister and his brother. But then what happened was, after a while there, they started to miss the East End, and ended up actually coming back in amongst the mix of it. So that was war, terrible thing. My mum at this time was in Jamaica, for a little tiny village called Nain and St Elizabeth, and there a little place called Alligator Pond, a fishing village. Of course, far and distant from the war. Didn't have very much. It was a farming village, people had no water as such. Used to walk 2 miles with a pot on their head, literally to bring back water every day. Very, very, very hard life, exceptionally hard. So after the war, as you said, when it settled, there was obviously a campaign, and they wanted to bring people to Britain, and the idea was basically to rebuild Britain, because as I said, it was blown to bits. And the idea was to, approach the Commonwealth countries, who had, lots of these men from the Commonwealth had fought in the Second World War, with different regiments coming out of all the, islands, particularly obviously Jamaica, and obviously we know India was a huge contributor to the war. And basically the campaign went. So it was 1951. My mother was already married in Jamaica, and she had my eldest sister. Her husband at the time, he came over first. He came over at the same time as the Windrush, and she came to join him later in 1951. What happened was pushed a lot of Jamaicans over as well. A new bill was actually introduced. I think it was called a Carter Bill. I'm not too sure about it. But
the British Nationality Act?
No, it was an American bill, basically. What
Right.
it done was it was introduced in America because a lot of people from the Jamaica and the Caribbean would have went into America. But what happened was they basically blocked immigration off completely over there. So it pushed a lot of people, you know, towards Britain even more so. My mum, she flew to Canada, which of course was another Commonwealth country, and then she boarded a ship basically and came to England in December 1951. So we couldn't even start to imagine how that would have been. How, you know, you had smog, terrible cold, you know, it would have been a freezing environment, and you're coming from this beautiful, you know, tropical island.
Totally.
Even though you haven't got a lot, you've still got the sun and you've still got the sea and you've still got that around you to come here, and then suddenly you're dropped in the centre of it all.
It was a culture shock.
Massive culture shock, and people were coming here as well from the West Indies at that time. I said, you know, in abundances to start work. You know, they're advertising for the new NHS. A lot of, you know, people wanted to build the London transport system, not to mention obviously the rebuilding, you know, work and builders and things like this. So it was a abusive relationship that my mum came to with her first husband. He used to beat her terribly. She used to give back as good as she got, though. She was a very feisty woman. She wouldn't have it, you know. Anyway, she left him, her first husband, and she met my dad. My dad, though, was an interesting character because he was a real East End cockney, as I said. You know, he had, obviously, you know, he had a handful of brothers and two sisters. And again, all from the East End, out of Oxton, Stoke Newington. All were bricklayers, builders, so they all took on the trades of my grandfather. And my dad also, he enterprised into a paraffin business, because back then people used to have paraffin heaters. That's how it used to work as a heating, you know, electricity, things like that were very, you know, minimal. So people would, you know, use the old heater for the thing. So they used to have what was a tanker, effectively like a flatbed lorry with a tanker on it, and like literally a tap, and people would come out with their sort of tins, and then they'd get like paraffin from him. And he had a route, him and his brother-in-law, and that ran from what was Casenoff Road in Stoke Newington. Ironically, that's where the at that time, that's where the two Craig brothers lived.
That's right.
And on a little court they lived on there. That's correct. Yeah. So the route started from there, and it ran all the way to Hampstead. So it was basically, imagine going all these different, you know, houses, literally stop. Like I suppose you would have the back then we had, well, after my generation, you had the Alpine man, and you had these different things that would go door to door, because that's how, you know, services was. And he expanded with the paraffin business, as I said, him and his brother-in-law, so they opened up more routes. But a lot of the areas were around, you know, Stoke Newington and Hackney. So a lot of people coming in from the West Indies living here. And he had a friend, a guy called Billy Hill, not to be mistaken with the notorious gangster from West London, Billy Hill. Billy and his wife Sadie were, you know, basically two West Indians who became very ambitious. And Billy wanted to actually open an entertainment club, because people tried to have little parties at their house with a gramophone, but it wasn't really an established music venue they could go to. So he had a property at 60 Green Lanes, Haringey. And basically, you know, it's now into an I believe now it's a big coffee shop. Maybe we could go and actually have a look at that, because that'd be quite historic to look at. So my dad, knowing that Billy would, you know, have problems, and Dad also, Billy he had great, you know, he was very well established in the West Indian community, you know. So he wanted to do paraffin, so my dad supplied him with paraffin, and obviously Billy then had like lots of different roads throughout Stoke Newington and Hackney where he would supply those routes. Anyway, my dad became the like a director, company secretary of the business they set up, which managed to give them the dance license. You know, initially they didn't have a drink license, so they used to sell, you know, Pepsi laced with scotch and things like that from underneath, like the counter.
Under the counter,
yeah. literally. And then obviously they played music, you know, as traditional, just before the sound systems really sort of arrived. They used to have gramophone and they played records, which came from some of the very, very
was
early
it like R&B
labels.
type? R&B.
Yeah, they were what they called. They were called soft wax back then. So soft wax used to come over from America. They were R&B records, you know, Fats Domino, things like this. This was preceding all these stuff that we modern know, and also did mento, which is a style of music which preceded calypso, you know. So those were the general, you know, the music genre that will be played. It wasn't until later on in the 60s that ska came about, you know. But you're talking about the 50s still here. This is a very early introduction of, you know, Caribbean music coming over. Even the sound systems in Jamaica played mento and played R&B, you know, Sir Cox and Dodd and, you know, people like that, and Duke Reid. These were what they were spinning. So it was very current and with the time. So he had the club there. My dad actually met my mum, not at a club, funny enough. He met my mum at a party he was invited to, and it was a house party. My mum went there with two of her friends, Maud and Carmen. Which was quite a funny story really, because they all lived in this house together, because back then it was terrible conditions you used to have. So it was like 3 people to a room. It was £1 a person, and you'd have maybe one bed in there, so one person would sleep on the chair, one in the bed, and the other one would be working, and they'd have to rotate that, you know. And as I said, you know, you had all the factories, local factories, where they would work like night shift, and, you know, right through, well, right the way through. Mum worked at a light bulb factory initially, and a dress factory, you know. It was like literally like that, you know. What you could get, you took, you know. And she met my dad at a party they was invited to, and basically, you know, very funny. 2 people with very little but a lot of ambition. They got together, and you know, they sort of, you know, made it a go. And in 1961 they bought their first property. But my mum, preceding that, you know, she'd independently sort of lifted herself up, because one of the houses they were staying in, as I said, you know, before she met my father, one day she came back from work, and she saw everyone literally on the pavement, you know, everyone had been evicted. And what happened was, 2 of her friends, Maud and Carmen, went to Ridley Road Market back then to get some like water jelly coconuts, and of course you've got to break those open. So they were breaking the coconuts open on the doorstep. You know, the Jewish landlord, he got wind of it. Obviously someone said they're breaking coconuts, blah blah blah, so he evicted the whole lot. You know, there's no such thing as tenancy agreement, nothing like that. Everyone was out on the street that night, and she was very determined and resilient. And it was like, you know, I'm never going to be in a position where someone can put me out of my house onto the street. So she really thought and wanted to devise and build things. And one of the systems that she actually built but utilised was a partner system. And a partner system back then, you got to understand, was they faced a lot of, you know, racism. It was very, very hard coming over here at that particular time. Banks wouldn't give you mortgages, you know, your credit lines weren't open. It wasn't like it was if you were born in England, you were like, you know, you're an alien and you were tricked like that. So she had a partner system, which was a community bank. So people within her circle, which was a huge circle, who had jobs, they got their regular, you know, pay packet. They each week would donate a certain amount. So it might be a couple of pounds, whatever it will be, from their wages each week, and then a pot would be created of money. And, you know, you have up to 50, 80 people in some of these partners, and these partners could run for like 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years even. And what it meant was, this pot of money was then accumulated each week or each month to disperse to someone like an interest-free loan. But that interest-free loan was a considerable amount of money back then, because when you think about it, houses, terraced houses, sold, you know, in 1960, in 1958, anywhere from 500 to 1,200 pounds, you know, houses that are worth like, you know, upwards of 1.5, 2 million pounds now. So you've got to understand the, you know, where it really went, the insight they had, or the foresight to this. So she, as the banker, used to distribute obviously the pot, and then people would get their first house, in many cases their first business. It was used as a stepping stone for the West Indian community. And, you know, mum and dad, they got their first house in 1961 together. And my dad, being a builder, he utilised his skills, and he got a lot of work from the West Indian community, obviously, because we were very well-known people. it wasn't long before my mum, you know, took her entrepreneurial spirit and made my dad convert the basement of the house into a clothes boutique. Like everything, we looked for opportunities. She knew a Maltese a guy that owned a clothing factory. And what happened back then was most of the kind of clothes, people wouldn't go to the boot, you know, like a big shop. They couldn't afford to. And, you know, it was like, it didn't happen. So a lot of people bought their clothes from the catalogue. So the two big catalogues were Freeman's and Littlewoods. And these were very, you know, like, you had also the pools. People come around and do the pools, you know, to door to door. You had a traditional set of things, and buying clothes was out of the two catalogues. And it so turned out that the fella who owned the clothing factory, he used to stitch dresses for Freeman's and Littlewoods. So they would send him the rolls of cloth, basically, and then on each roll of cloth he may be able to produce, I don't know, say 30 dresses or 40 dresses. But ultimately there'll be cloth left over on the reel. So he would do an overrun, and the overrun's called cabbage, basically. That's what they call it, cabbage cloth, right? Perfectly good cloth, just overrun. So he would then produce the additional run of dresses, and then what she would do is she'd buy the additional run of dresses. So every single, you know, roll of cloth that came there with every single pattern that they were going to sew for the catalogue, she would get all their basically surplus stock. But what was ironic about it was it took time for him then to get them to the catalogues. They had to go through a process. So she would then get the dresses before the catalogue even had them. So all her stuff that she would sell would come out a month before the actual physical catalogue even had them. So you can imagine how exclusive that was.
What a genius.
Genius.
Your mum's a genius.
Absolute genius. Wow. Yeah, that's how I could describe it.
I'm blown away by that.
Crazy. And yeah, so she's done that, and we were already near Ridley Road Market, and Ridley Road Market was one of those places where all the West Indian women would come on a Saturday because they could get all the the foods they wanted, you know, all the yams and the dashings and all the stuff that they couldn't get anywhere else. It was the Ridley Road Market that stocked it. So they would come by the house on a Saturday, obviously go downstairs to the boutique, try on dresses, and, you know, sort of buy their dresses for their, you know, going out and what have you. And it was like that. It was a hub of activity at our house, and, you know, a big pot of chicken soup or beef soup would be on the boiling away in the oven. Everyone would be like that. And we had that upbringing of powerful community, you know. And she then branched that even further because she realised that a lot of people, her friends, had great networks of people as well. So what she realised was that actually she had so much stock, she used to give them they call them a grip, but they're like a suit, what they call like suitcase of dresses. So she would have a business with them, so she would give them dresses on a sale or return agreement, like, so they would have a commission, like this is pre-Avon, you know, you had to think of an Avon lady, but my mum used to do it with dresses, so she used to give them to different people on consignment, these dresses. So she actually wasn't just running a boutique for the basement of the house, she had about 40 different women who were going out with dresses, selling in their communities. So the business was actually, you know, it was a flourishing business. You know, you think about every aspect of an entrepreneur, it had every element there, you know, in actual genius to put the whole thing together in such a way. And, you know, she's done that, and then with that they were able to buy more houses. My dad would work and he would do up, and then it was a question of renting houses to people coming over, because that's what it was all about, building a community. A lot of people were coming over, they wanted to save so they could bring over other relatives, and they wanted to save so they could get their own house. They were, compared to what people were getting with a lot of the Jewish landlords, which were terrible, you know, they were slum conditions, she was actually taking care of her own people in a great way. It was giving them dignity, you know, to have a nice roof over their head, to feel part of something. And then when they got their house, because they'd climbed the ladder, their relatives would come over. If they couldn't stay with them, they'd, you know, stay at that house. So it was a wonderful thing that she'd done, my parents. They were very highly respected people in the West Indian community and English community alike, because you've got to understand, my dad never saw colour. He was coming from an environment, you've got to understand, it was east end of London at the time, you know, Moseley, you had some serious stuff going on. And for him to be with my mum, it was a huge statement. And, you know, they went through a lot of, you know, racism and stuff like that, but it didn't bother them. You know, they dealt with it and they, you know, gave back as good as they got. It was like, nah, we're not going to suffer that. Do you know what I mean? And it was like, we're here, we're doing what we're doing, right? I know where we'll be in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Where will you be? And that's the greatest way to deal with people, I realised. Don't get caught up in bitterness. Don't get caught up in hate. Don't get caught up in all that stuff. Just get on with your life, because success is the greatest tool you can use to put in someone's face. And I see them grow, and I learned a lot from my parents. I learned about business. I understood what it was like. My mum used to say to me as a little boy, you know, she used to get them and ask me to count the money. Not because she wanted me to count the money, she couldn't get it herself. She wanted me to know what it was like to have money and to feel money, come in contact with it, you know, so I wouldn't be, you know, shocked or frightened of it. So as a little boy, that was, you know, what I'd done. And it wasn't until, I guess, after coming through primary school, I then started to really fall into music, because like anything, you go through those patterns, and like, as a kid, you know, you like just regular pop music that's out there. And then I kind of, you know, was around a lot of white kids at my secondary school, and, you know, they liked, we listened to, like, you know, which was the second revival of two-tone. So there was Madness, the Specials, the Selector. So, you know, we were like a kind of trendy casual mod, is what I'll call ourselves. So you weren't like, you know, full regalia of a mod. You'd have a trilby, but then you'd have a Lacoste t-shirt and a pair of Farrah trousers and a pair of suede kicks. Yeah, and that's what it was. And that was a casual kind of, and it's really funny to see all these things back then that we were wearing. The kids now actually wearing the same clothes. And it's so ironic, got gabichis and things like that.
That was full circle, didn't it?
Massive full circle, yeah. And then I think it was basically, I was about 15, and then I started to fall more into the black environment musically. You know, I started to really get to understand and love reggae music. I had, you know, relatives, extended family who were involved in the music industry as well. And I started to listen to more, and I started to then, you know, become part of that, you know, regular thing, doing the pilgrimage to all the record shops. And, you know, a great place we had was High Tech. That was one of the places we used to go to on Dalston Lane, because Dalston Lane was the epicenter. And around 15, 16 years old, when we was putting in our first parties, it was quite ironic, because back then we had you had a string of shops. You had High Tech, where you get different bits of kit, your cables and your some amplifiers. You had Elvin's next door to them. I think he may have been Trinidadian, actually, Elvin's, and he used to make preamps, and again you'd buy bits and pieces. You had two rockers, basically, you know, these guys with big beards, Johnson and Johnson, and these guys were done speakers. So they used to recone the speakers and sell like the 18-inch, you know, things like that, stuff you couldn't, you know, get generally. And then you had a record shop at the bottom of it, M&D. So on a Saturday, you would make that journey, you know, picking up the Jack Lees, the bits and pieces, the needle for the record from there. Then you would go there to collect the speakers or the speaker cables. Then you'd go to the record shop. The record shop was ironic, because you used to have a lot of pre-release 7-inches that you'd play reggae, and it was quite funny, because what was happening back at that time was when you used to go in there, the guy used to play the record, and then people would just put their hand up, and as they put their hand up, he used to just bag the records. What I didn't realise is a lot of the 7-inches weren't actually coming in from Jamaica. They were getting pressed here. So what they was doing was they were actually taking curry powder and rubbing them on the outside of the box. So when you got the 7-inch record, like, you know, with a bit of middle missing, which you thought was authentically coming from Jamaica, they were actually getting pressed there. But then people were getting deceived because the smell of the curry powder on the sleeve. You thought it's been sent over from there.
Really? I've never
yeah, all that, you know, listen, there was so much going on, you know, there was a whole thing, because British Lovers Rock as well took that same kind of thing, because at first it wasn't really accepted, you know, because people wanted Jamaican music. SoundSystem dominantly wanted Jamaican music. And coming over from there, so one of my, again, extended family, one of my uncles, he had a record shop on Green Road, and he was one of the main kind of people, you know, in the industry. He'd, you know, promoted events back in Jamaica as he was, you know, a young man. He used to put on Coxsone and Duke Reid, you know, so he was the epicenter of his stuff. And he became the distributor for Studio One, which was Coxsone Dodd. So obviously all the sound systems bought their music from him. So, you know, Shaka as a young guy, and Fat Man, and obviously Coxsone, who was now getting more superior sound system locally. They'd all go there. So he would be looked at as the authority on Jamaican music. So when he used to come over, they used to come over and they were playing the sound clashes. And it's funny because I heard Dennis before in an interview recently, and he used to have a sound called a Sufferer that he used to play down at the Aces with Fat Man. And he was saying that my uncle would attracted by this, and he was like, no, I don't really feel that record. And then Fat Man had bought it, and then when he played it down, the place blew up. So he was amazing A&R, you know what I mean? He knew all the tracks before they were going to go. So I was around music, full stop. Do you know what I mean? At the heart of it.
And you're Andy, you're a real historian as well.
Yeah.
I mean, when I've been talking to you for quite a while now about bits and pieces. And you're like me, you're like a sponge, you really know your history. And even if you didn't live through the kind of 50s and 60s, you really do know your stuff.
Yeah, it's imperative.
Those early blues parties, tell me why they started. What was the reason for the blues parties? Because I want to go quite heavy into the early blues party scene. Yeah. Why did they start? So the reason for the blues parties, basically, or the shebeens as they used to call them, was back again in the 50s, you couldn't go, they didn't have music venues where they have black music played, you know, black people weren't invited in there. It was as strict as that. So to keep and it's very important, people understand the importance of sound systems. So it was important to keep the community together. So people who had houses now, what they'd do is they'd clean up the living room or the basement, and they would then hold a blues party, and the blues party would be every Saturday night. And what it meant was that they would have someone, you know, cooking, so you'd get maybe not curry goat but curry lamb at that time, because you know it's different. You could get the goat, and you would have, you know, they used to have like long life beer, baby sham, you know, baby things sham. Like that with the drinks. Cherry B one, Cherry B, you know what I mean? These were the kind of things that you'd do. And it brought a sense of community together where everyone got together. And it wasn't just Jamaicans, it was West Indians, you know, Trinidadians, Barbadians, you know, St. Louisians. They all came over at the same time. So this was their release on a Saturday night and getting together. And this was the base of community, which people don't understand. Young people, they don't understand it. So Shebeens parties brought that together, you know, and they continued throughout. Even when clubs now are becoming a little bit more accessible, blues parties have the integrity to keep things going. And we'll talk about that in great deal, because a lot of credit isn't given or identified to, you know, scenes that have emerged like Acid House and, you know, like the whole warehouse party scenes, to its real origins, which are blues parties, which people don't even understand. But we're going to make that connection today and, you know, authorise to let you know this is real. You know, early blues parties, so SoundSystem started to emerge. How did they get the house? Would someone like say, look, we'll pay you some money? And no, the first people to buy the houses. So, like, for example, my mum was one of the people, she put blues parties on, but people she helped get their first property, you know, basically. Remember, these properties aren't little houses. So the idea of getting houses, you're talking about getting like 3-4 story houses, because, you know, they'd gone through the war, they'd been bombed out, and they were in terrible initial conditions. But, you know, it's particularly people, why do so many West Indians live in Brixton, people ask themselves. The reason being was because when the first Windrush generation arrived, or the first cohort of Windrush people, they were put in Clapham Common in an air raid shelter, which was specially converted basically for them to stay. Now, on their way to work, what would happen is they would actually pass through Brixton. So they saw the size of the houses, so they thought, when I get enough money, I want to buy it. The same thing with Stoke Newington. If you look on Amherst Road and all these roads, they're huge houses, okay? And it felt good because you had lots of family were coming over, and you realised, well, if I get the house, so-and-so can come, I can rent a room to so-and-so, and this is what was happening. So West Indians were buying these houses with the partner draw, a lot of them, to get their sort of self on the ladder, and then they were kind of, you know, building their way through to get their, you know, relatives here, and for them to sort of progress, you know, and fit into, you know, what the society was. And some people would say, actually, it's a great idea to put on a blues in the basement. So this is where they were coming. Some houses became known as blues houses. So you did have certain properties, and I could show you ones in Stoke Newington where you knew it was a blues house. Every Saturday night was a blues party there. And of course, it meant that community got together, but people also made money from those blues parties. But the sound systems now were starting to emerge, and this was like people like Duke Vin and Count Suckle. So these were the early guys who were really into this thing. You know, this preceded Coxon and
all the guys that we now know as, you know, real legacy foundation people, which they were.
Because they come over here, I think it was 1954 from Jamaica. I think Duke Vin and Count Suckle come over together on the ship. I
believe they did. The first time Suckle played was my uncle, extended family. He hired the Marquee Club, which was the first club really to play, you know, West Indian music, because it played like jazz, do you know what I mean, and stuff. It was a jazz club for the black GIs who were coming over from America during the war. And he managed to convince, you know, the owners basically on Wardour Street to put on a sound system night. But that was the first time, I think it was 1961 he done that, was the first time sound system had ever went into the West End. And then what he then proceeded was incredible, because he then got a venue on Carnaby Street. And Carnaby Street back then was literally factories. They were clothing factories.
You sent me that interview with your family member, and it was fascinating. He was saying that Carnaby Street, there was loads of warehouses. It's not like, because there was no tourism really back then.
Didn't exist back then.
People weren't really taking off on planes on cheap flights. It was like, you know, once you was in the country, you kind of stayed there.
You were there.
That was that.
Yeah, and it was ironic because when they opened, it was called Roaring Twenties, and this is where Coxon became a resident, you know. But the first system he had was Suckle. As I said, he brought Suckle into the West End. Then Suckle was a resident down at the Roaring Twenties, then preceded by Coxon. I mean, it was an amazing club because they stayed open very late. So what you got to understand was, back then, you had stuff, it was, you know, the 60s, right? So you had, you know, John Lennon, you know, you had all these people who were out there in this thing, who were kind of looking for places, looking for contact, looking for people. You know, Lennon was a regular visitor of the Roaring Twenties. I think it was hilarious. One day he told me a story, and he actually done a documentary. A documentary was a relationship between reggae and the Beatles and the music they played and rock. Anyway, he'd put this documentary together, and when he'd completed the documentary, he'd basically he go on the BBC the following day. He got a phone call, said, "Look, you can't put it on there because you know, you've got Beatles music in it, and it ain't cleared. You cannot use it." And he was like, "What?" He's phoning up the manager, you know, wouldn't take his call, do you know what I mean? And he's pulling his hair out, and he phoned John Lennon, because he knew John Lennon very well. So John was like, "Take what you want, Jim, just use it." And John cleared all the music for him and let him play it. And he produced the documentary showing the relationship between reggae and, you know, what was early rock. So, you know, that again was a great moment. But back at those clubs, as we've got to understand, the people who used to go there, you had, you know, high society, because they wanted to stay out all night. A lot of them wanted to get some weed. It was a thrill-seeking thing as well, you know. Tell me
what Soho was like back then as well, because it ain't like what we see today. Is it all polished and shiny?
Soho was a different thing. Soho was Soho was it was a very seedy place, first of all, right? So you had a lot of Maltese who controlled prostitution. So Soho was looked at as a prostitution hub. That was the first thing. Then West Indian guys who were sometimes involved in that. Jamaicans, not so much Jamaicans, a lot of Trinidadians and stuff like that, and it was lethal because they like snitch each other like it was ever pouring a cold pint, do you know what I mean? So there was no integrity in terms of, like, you know, a villainy and stuff. It was absolutely lethal. So they'd grass up each other's, the pimps, thinking if they was in prison, they'd get their girl that had, you know, was making loads of money, they could pimp her, do you know what I mean? So it was absolutely a crazy thing. And the Maltese were like the biggest kind of, you know, people involved in that back then in Soho. They had it on lockdown, you know. So when people were coming into the Western SoundSystem thing on bringing events into Soho, it was very abnormal. Do you know what I mean? It was a seedy kind of place. You had cabaret, you know. So cabaret was also a big thing, you know. You had the Raymond's, you know, Raymond's Review Bar. You had these kind of places which were more of a upmarket sort of thing. But then you had, which would have, you know, the really dodgy stuff as well.
Peep shows and...
Soho and the West End wasn't modernised really until, you know, the 70s. You know, it was, when you talk about the 60s, you know, it was a very seedy place. You know, it was the gradual development that kind of brought it in. And of course, we know the West End now as, you know, the place of all the clubs. It's the mecca of everything. But it wasn't back then. It was a very kind of very seedy, sort of backhanded, dodgy little place to go to, you know.
There was a big mod club there as well called The Scene, where a lot of in Ham Yard, where a lot of the mods would also hang out and play R&B, soul, and also so ska.
Yeah, well, the music is, again, remember the music was basically prejudiced against. So these were the only clubs you could get where they played all that. So, you know, you had like Wardour Street had a few clubs on it, you know, and you had a little congregation of these clubs. And of course, people, again, they have little understanding because the skinhead thing. So back then you had the skinhead thing, but the skinheads actually really loved the West Indians, because especially the Jamaicans, because of the scar, because of the fashion, and those integrated incredibly well. These were the Trojan skinheads, I call them, because of the days of Trojan records really taking off. But then if we sort of fast forward that now, sort of 10, 15 years, there was a new generation of skinheads that arrived, and these skinheads were aligned with the National Front Party.
Like late 70s?
Yeah, so this was about 70, I remember from sort of 76, it was really kind of a big scene. And what was funny was this, so at the time, remember, I'm sort of 76, I was sort of 10 years old, 77, 78, you know, 12, you know, 11, 12, 13. And what you used to have was, you had the skinheads who used to dominantly march down from Oxford. So these ones, they had swastika on their forehead or on their side of their neck, long Crombie coat, these big Dr. Martin boots with these red laces, you know, and they hated the Pakistanis. I really felt sorry for them because they got the worst of the rant. You know, they didn't like black people, full stop. I never made themselves very clear about it, you know, putting NF everywhere and all that. But what the highlight of the Saturday night used to be was on the high street, you used to have a big cinema, which is called Earth now. It's a club, basically, where they have drum and bass, lots of kinds of things. But it used to be called ABC Cinema. And ABC Cinema used to do late runs of the Kung Fu films. So back then it was like Bruce Lee, Fists of Fury, Enter the Dragon. These were huge things. Like all the kids would have the posters of Bruce Lee with the mirrors and the you know, the scars on his face and all that. And then dominantly all the young black and mixed race guys who were the soul boys used to go there and watch the Kung Fu films. They all thought they were Bruce Lee. With the big afros, afro comb at the back of the head, the Gabici tops, Adidas Gazelle trainers, the corduroy, thick corduroy jeans with a little cut on the side. You know, it was like a casual boy. That was the uniform we had. And then the skinheads would be coming down on a Saturday night, and then to fight with the punk rockers who were coming in from Camden. But then when they would come down, they'd end up sort of almost hitting Dalston Junction, past the Rio and coming down to the ABC. So all the black and mixed race kids were coming out of the thing, and of course they weren't going to necessarily be punk rock lovers, but they was going to have it with the skinheads. So you'd have all these guys with flying elbows and flying kicks, and it was a full on, it was out of a film, it was a kung fu film, literally. You know, flying kicks and elbows and everything going on outside there, you know, and then they would tear up, go on for like a good 15, 20 minutes till the police from Stoke Newton come and would grab everyone and beat the shit out of them, do you know what I mean? And it was that was the madness of the pecking order, I suppose. You had the skinheads, you had the casuals, you had these different things, then you had the old Bill, who were the most, you know, the worst out of everyone.
Because the police were very brutal back then as well.
They were terrible. Back then, what they used to do was, I remember it's so funny, because they used to hit the clubs heavily. Like Four Races was a regular one. There was a copper that used to work there called Ginge. He was the most notorious one of them all. And they used to take fun out of smashing through the door. So, you know, they wouldn't go in there normally. They'd have to go full-fledged with batons and, you know, break the door down and attack it and all that. That's how they generally used to operate back then. Out of Stoke Newton. And I remember we used to nick her chipboard to get the speaker for the speakers. So there used to be a bigger builders merchants not far from where we was, and obviously they had a climbable fence, you know what I mean, where all the 8 before chipboard sheets used to be, you know. So used to go over there at night, sneak the chipboard and then carry it back on her head. No van, no cars, you know what I mean, to get it, to store it up, to make speaker boxes. And if you were really unlucky and the SPG vans, you should literally just crawl the back streets. If you got caught by them, you were in trouble, do you know what I mean? And you went to Stokey police station, you were in for it. They used to do a mattress beating, so they used to have a blue mattress, they used to throw that on you, and then they'd all have like 3 or 4 of them come in the cell with truncheons and literally, you know, smash the living shit out you. And you're talking about not even, you know, 16, 17-year-old kids you're doing this to, do you know what I mean? Grown fucking men. It's like, it was incredibly vicious and hostile. And not that I can turn around and say that all right, it justifies what happened, but what happened had to happen. And in 81, it's when it exploded. The riots exploded in Brixton, and it went off in Dalston, you know, and it went off across the country because it was the police brutality that was going on.
That was a turning point, wasn't it? And that was a turning point.
It was a turning point, you know. And I remember that when it went off in 81, and it was absolutely mad because it was building up. It went off in Brixton, and then it was coming down. You could see it because the tension was just building. I remember the street, everyone was out on the street, black and white, you know, and the police were there. The police guarded. There used to be at the bottom of Sandringham Road, which became the front line, a petrol station, you know, and the police were guarding the petrol station because they were making petrol bombs them, and the police all there with the riot squads all teed up there, and you just had, I mean, a mile long row of people teeing up waiting for the night to fall. But then the first night it went off, and I mean the next morning it was insane.
Carnage.
Well, people clocked on as well. You used to have some really nice shoes. So people used to wear the crocodile skin shoes, like £300 a pair, and all these things. So there were people that I knew older than me were doing shopping lists, so they was going around to people say, right, what do you want? And it was like, you know, they want them shoes out the window, whatever. And literally people was going in, smashing out the windows and taking to order gear to go and sell. And I mean, in the road, the next devastation. I mean, beds were out in the middle of the street. It was,
weren't brick walls being like kicked down so they could use like bricks as weapons?
It was mad. Walls were being kicked down. I remember the Argus, which was next to the petrol station. The police couldn't do anything about it. They went in there and they literally had someone at the top who took the conveyor belt on and was, you know, letting the stuff come down. They cleaned it out completely. Walls were getting kicked down to draw bricks so they could throw missile bricks, and as you said, everyone was tearing up with petrol, and there was petrol bombing the police. But then Johnson's Caff was on the corner, but Johnson's Caff was looked at as a hot spot, you know, that's where a lot of the youths would hang out. It was actually the police that smashed out the windows of Johnson's Caff. Can you imagine that? So you got a riot and the police are smashing out the windows themselves because they're so pissed off. That's where it's all congregating from. You know, and I said it was mad. That was it was a fiery time, and then.
But what was the reason? Was because basically
it was
everyone
too much.
Had enough.
It was too much. It built up to the degree that the police were getting away with a lot of stuff.
Because before that, we had the Notting Hill riots. I think was in 1958.
Yeah, the Notting Hill riots basically was the first time there had been an issue, but it couldn't even come in close to what went off in 81.
Brixton was huge.
Because 81 was this landmark as well, and that was basically the time of this is just before Thatcher found herself in government, and it was a point that Britain was boiling up. People don't realise some of this stuff with Britain because people have got this modern thing in their head that, it's always been fabulous, great. I remember in the 70s, they used to turn electricity off, right? They had power cuts, yeah? They used to turn electricity off.
I remember that, and you sit there with candles.
Candles, yeah?
I remember that.
Candles, right? There were bodies that couldn't be buried, right? You had bodies stacking up, do you know what I mean? At fucking morgues. It was a state of a third world country, do you know what I mean?
London was still, we're talking like maybe sort of 20 or 30 years still after World War II.
We're talking about the 1970s,
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? We're talking about when countries, I remember us going to Jamaica in the 1970s, and relatives in Jamaica were feeling sorry for us living in England, right? So people sometimes are so off the mark, they have no idea, really. You've got to look back and, it's
bomb sites.
It was a fun bomb site.
My mum and dad were playing literally on bomb sites.
So when people come and put in hard work to try to bring it to a standard, which, made it livable, you've got to pay credit to those people. Do you know what I mean? They contribute a lot to this country. And the culture of it, as I said, was ingrained. The music was becoming a big, massive part of it. The food was becoming a big part of it. And there are more and more white kids now at this time starting to adapt to our culture. Do you know what I mean? So you used to start to see the white kids now going to the blues parties as well. But the sound system thing, they were big sound system clashes and used to go up to our school, and it sounds like Saxon coming through, who were becoming the first real generation of British dancehall style sounds, where they had people who would go on the mic like Papa Levy and Somali Culture and all these other guys. So around 81 it was changing a different direction again. Lovers Rock had broken again. Lovers Rock, the whole thing started up at the Four Races. So the Four Races Club, Lloydie Cox used to have a talent competition there. A young girl, Louise Marks, she won the event, he produced her. Dennis Bovell had his sound system based there. He produced Janet Kay's classic record, Silly Games. I remember speaking to him about that track as well. If you ever listen to that track, Silly Games, it plays incredibly high, because what they used to do was, they used to cut the tracks, they used to set the levels higher, so on the radio you'd hear it above all the other tracks, but you actually put it in distortion. So when you actually hear the song, you'll hear levels of distortion in there, because it plays over all the other records, it plays louder, you know. And that was a hit. And then we had Lovers Rock Chain, so we had Trevor Waters, you had a whole chain of British artists now coming out, and now you had the Jamaican artists mimicking British Lovers Rock. So we'd come to a point through SoundSystem culture, we'd had a full 360 and we turned it, you know, we actually had something we could call British. And what's really interesting, and I'm going to put the correlations together with other music now as well at some point, because that had its British stamp on it. From there, the SoundSystem culture did continue. You know, as I said, the SoundSystem's obviously merged, not as it did its height in between 81 and 83. But we started to see around about 85 soul sounds coming through. So where, you know, we'd moved away purely from reggae and lovers rock, there was a now revival of rare groove coming into play. And what it meant, obviously, there were two big advents to this. The introduction of SL1200 turntables, because they never existed in this country. There was a guy called Froggy. He had the most prolific sound system there was.
Froggy was amazing, wasn't he?
White guy, yeah. And
amazing mixer.
He was part of the Funk Mafia. He was one of the first real mixers. We've got to give him credit for this. But he was actually a BT engineer. So he was a technical guy. So he used to make his own kit, a lot of the kit. And he went out to Paradise Garage to see Larry Levan play and mix, and he saw the SL1200. He bought a pair of decks when he was out there and brought them back. But those were the first SLs in the country. And then when people then started to realise, if you put mats on these, you could start a scratch. And this is when you probably realised the hip-hop, the scratching thing was coming into play. So this now was creating a whole new base with, you know, electro. That was becoming a massive thing here. Again, now we were having another musical sort of revolution. But the underbelly of this now was moving towards selective music, connoisseurs of music, and pirate radio was coming into play now. So you had all the early ones, you had JFM, Radio and Victor was the first one, not the one on the ship, but a little station they had people like Steve Devon, and on there you had Bluebird Records was the only record shop you used to get the 12-inch imports from. They used to sort of advertise it, you know, and they would come on a Sunday exclusively. I think it was from midday till midnight. And it was basically, that was it, switched to midnight, bang, that was your lot. So pirate radio was the thirst for it. And you had DBC, Dread Broadcast Corporation, which is Radio Rebel. They came on a Sunday, they played reggae as well. Then they started to pop up gradually, you know. And this was the advent of more music coming into the play and becoming more commercially available.
Obviously, your LWRs and your Kiss FM.
Yeah, they were, well, so Kiss was a progression basically from JFM. So you had like Horizon Radio, you had JFM, and then you had the early DJs who were on these sets. And I'm talking about big DJs, you know, Gold Peterson, Pete Tong, big names.
Norman J.
Massive name, all Norman J.
Colin Dow, Colin Favour.
They all Trevor Nelson. They all came from it, right? Because it was a hub of everything basically, because it's where you could play your music freely. And where you had your audience to stage you. So they used to pay to go on there. They used to pay a tenner to get basically their spot. So into it they could advertise their gigs, and the clubs now would open and they think, okay, if I have indies on the radio, so that'd give them work as well. So that was the whole thing which was moving around in the, you know, the 80s, mid-80s. And then we had the next progression, which was the soul blues. As I said, so the soul blues, the big sound systems now, realised that sound was becoming more attractive. What's attractive? Where you had the ugly old speaker boxes, you were having flared bins, you were having, you know, these acoustic speaker boxes that looked pretty decent, and you'd have banks of speakers. Like, you know, I remember we used to go down to Night Hill Carnival, and then under the motorway you used to have the cage, and the cage basically under the flyover we used to have Mastermind, and Mastermind were the first real sound to be breaking up on 3 decks. Do you know what I mean? Herbie and that. So this was the breakthrough. This drove off a track. I mean, Jocelyn Brown, somebody else's guy, had the most deepest bass line on it ever. But that was the one you used to be in the cage and look forward to hearing. Do you know what I mean? And you had again Norman J. Norman, actually, he started with his brother there, because his brother and him, Joey, they had a SoundSystem Great Tribulations GT, and he then broke away into Good Times Road Show, you know, and That was Norman J.
When we were seeing Norman J, I think it was around 85, 86 under the over at the carnival.
Westway, yeah.
He was DJing on like you know what decorators used to do, put the wallpaper up with. He had them. He was DJing on them. So the bus thing hadn't even taken place yet.
It's mad you say that, because my son now, he's taken into music, and that's what they do. Like that. But he's got his decks and all that stuff, and he's using an ironing board. Like, what are you doing, ironing board? And he said, "This is the thing." Do you know what I mean? That because it's a feature that people remember you for. You know, but the sound system culture of back then, as I said, you know, it was about big sound systems, and you know, him and his brother had a really fearsome sound system, you know. And then, as I said, when he moved into the more in depth as a connoisseur on the rare groove, and I think it was shaken finger pop is how he developed. But at that time, it was really, really good, because now I was developing as a DJ as well.
Using rare groove as well, wasn't you?
I collected rare groove.
Andy P.
So that was me. So basically, I started to do nothing on the scale of what Norman J or the you know, special branch events were, but they were, you know, events. I'd hire coaches. We'd go out to the coast. The old Epping Forest Country Club, before it was you know, modernised, had different little halls you used to be able to hire. So I used to hire those, sell tickets, put on the events, and the grooves were breaking through. You know, Voices of East Highland, Wanted, Dead or Alive, Graham McRae, Love That I'm Giving. There was a bunch of great music, and you know, bump and hustle music, Tommy Stewart. So we were collecting music, and it had great value. And I used to get a lot of music from a guy who I knew from old sound system. When I had Mellow Magic with two of my friends, Richard, who went into music distribution. So before that, we started a sound like five of us actually in total, three of us from the same road and one from around the corner, one from Clapton Pond. We put a sound together called Mellow Magic, and that was our first introduction. So we used to hire little places. There was a place on Dunlace Road. We used to hire guys to do dominoes in the back of it, built it like a covered over the whole of his back garden, literally completely fire hazard, and used to rent it out for 60 quid a night. So we used to hire that and play sound. So, you know, we used to play Trends, Glenn, whose father used to own, which was actually, we could actually look at that spot, which was it was Phoebe's, then it became Willow's, then it became Trends. But that was actually a club which the Craigs put their name to. It was actually some brothers called Barry Brothers that owned it, which was the Regal, you know, which is just down the road on Amherst Road. But that was a 3-story building, and he had Glenn's brother, Danny Casanova, he played Lovers Rock. You had Josh Shucker play there. You had 3 stories, and we played Trends there sometimes, their road show. We played Apollo, and Apollo was one of the big sounds as well. And there's a guy called Cass there, who was a collector of music. He called himself Cass Manhattan later years, but I was buying loads of music from him. And Richard, he started working for the record shop, which was G&M on Mare Street, him and Trevor Nelson, because Trevor lived on the next road to us. So the pair of them used to go around literally shop to shop, putting up posters advertising the music. And all the people that were coming around us was mad, because obviously the following road after that we had Carl Hyman, who became Shut Up and Dance, and obviously Kevin, who you now know as DJ Hype. Kevin used to be part of the sound as well. Remember his first day he got his SL1200s, because before that was one deck and a piece of sponge. And then, you know, when these SLs had arrived now,
it was a game changer,
this was a game changer for everyone, you know. And the music was developing, the sounds were getting more, you know, complicated. I started to do events, but preceding that, when I was still onto the sound system stuff, me and some friends who I went to college with in Waltham Forest, they had a sound called Mellow Rockers. So we aligned our systems, used to actually hire them out. So people used to have parties over Cattle Hall Estate, which was a huge estate in Leytonstone, but used to have Derek Boland, God rest his soul, used to play there, Bobby and Steve. And these were very, very early soul blues. So this was the breakthrough, as you know, Sahara, Love So Fine and Freak For You, and all these tracks were breaking through, and you know, you'd mix up Hi Ho from, you know, Snow White and Seven Dwarfs into it. So there was a whole mixing generation coming in now, a whole musical generation. This is where you had the Paul Andersons now coming into their own right, because, you know, Paul was a master of mixing. Paul Trouble Anderson. And you know, you had great guys now emerging from the scene, right? And then we had this massive thing arrive, and the thing arrived, and what I explained to people was acid house and Balearic beat. Acid house created by an Indian film composer. Okay, he actually had two pieces of equipment, basically, and it created electrical beats. If this is early tracks, they're acid house.
I listened to that. You told me about it, Andy. I listened to it. I was blown away. I was like, I've never heard this. It was like acid techno house.
Well, it was. That was it. That's where it started. But it wasn't fully commercialised. But yet Chicago got it, and you know there were places then that started to develop it, right? And we got the beat coming over as imported back to us as we believe the first turn of acid house. But that's where it started. The lyric beat, yeah, came from Ibiza, and that scene was brought back. But it was a club thing. Warehouse parties was not a club thing. This was a generation from blues parties. So where we broke into houses, and we were doing it since the 1950s, and putting on events in squats or catchment houses, warehouse was just bigger venues because people were coming out of the clubs, high on ecstasy, don't want to go home. Where do you want to go? Dance all night. Acid house party. And that is where the origin should really be accepted. And we should be saying, wow, we have to give credit to blues party. This is another natural progression that came from the Afro-Caribbean community, okay, and the culture that started warehouse parties in this country. Not in America. It wasn't imported from America. We got it right here. The Windrush generation gave it to us. Do you know what I mean? From the 50s, we carried it on. So that's an important statement, you know what I mean, to me to make, and I will stand by that. I will challenge, anyone can come and challenge me that. And the progression after acid house, and I wasn't part of this because I went to Jamaica, but you know, the whole thing with jungle and drum and bass, this was again like the Lovers Rock. British guys here and British girls were tired of listening to records coming from America. They wanted to start producing their own stuff, and they made it here. And again, a lot of it came from the Jamaican roots. So it was the same artists and the records getting cut up basically and put into these early jungle tracks, and you know, progressing into drum and bass. That again, we have to give credit to that generation for starting.
Well, if anyone disagrees, please leave a little message below.
Yeah, 100%. I think music back then was what we used to keep it in order, and no record company is going to sign you if that's what's coming out your mouth, and people ain't getting that. Do you know what I mean? Successful artists ain't just sing about love songs. Bob Marley was the most revolutionist artist to ever step on the face of this earth. Remember, I'm coming from warehouse parties, illegal parties, breaking into used warehouses, completely unlicensed events, and here we go, a drop in time, and you're going to go now and sit with, you know, senior, high-ranking officers who are borough commanders. Which I watched before I was going to meet you. I watched it about 2 weeks ago. Okay. I'll tell you what a documentary. How did that all come about? So look.